So listen, we're going to go right with this. With us now, right here on the Ken and Mike Show, is a philosopher of science who received his PhD from the University of Cambridge. He is a former geophysicist and college professor who now directs Discover Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. Is that still correct? You're still
Correct.
That's
Yes,
awesome.
indeed.
And he has multiple best-selling books, such as Darwin's Doubt. And we're going to talk about his newest book as well, which is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen Meyer, thank you so much for joining us here on the Ken and Mike Show. We really appreciate you being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, before we get into obviously you have some great articles. I watched some great videos with you talking about science, which is way above my pay grade. And but I want
Proverbial pay grade.
yeah, right. But I do want to make mention of something right off the cuff that hit my eye right away. That is that you so brilliantly explain that, like a belief in God, you have to take atheism on faith as well. So for me personally, if I wasn't a true believer, I'd almost want to take my chances on God anyway, just because I just feel there's so many things that point to Him anyway. And I guess the question is what is going on in the world today? And you mentioned, of course, the Judeo-Christian Christianity in the past compared to now. Why has it changed drastically? And what is going on that why aren't they looking to God, especially in the science world?
Well, that's a big part of what the book is about. There's been a dramatic shift in worldview from the time of the inception of modern science, which historians call the period of the scientific revolution. That's dated roughly from 1500 to 1750 by many historians. It stretches back, I think, even deeper, the roots of the what we call modern science back into the 1300s. Where a lot of the scientific methods were first developed at the great medieval universities of Oxford and University of Paris and so forth. But another big point is that science developed in a Judeo-Christian context in Western Europe, and historians of science point to many specific Judeo-Christian ideas that contributed to the rise of modern science. One, that nature has an order built into it, and that can be discerned by the rational intellect of human beings. The early scientists had a concept they called intelligibility. They believed that nature could be understood because it had been produced by a rational mind, namely the mind of God, and that we could understand the order and the design and the rationality that had been built into nature because our minds had been made in the image of the creator of the universe itself. And so there was a principle of correspondence between the rationality built into nature and the rationality that we had been gifted with by our creator. There are many other connections that historians have made, but in any case, you had figures like Newton and Boyle and Johannes Kepler, who were the pioneers who got modern science going. Then in the late 19th century, there was a kind of shift, and the scientific world picture that we inherited from the period of the scientific revolution, which was decidedly theistic, was replaced by a larger worldview, which scholars call materialistic or scientific materialism, sometimes also called scientific naturalism. And that worldview came to dominate the scientific community, the scientific ethos coming into the 20th century. And in many ways, that perspective is still with us. But the argument of my new book is that it shouldn't be, because we have made discoveries over the last 100 years, first in cosmology and astrophysics and astronomy, then in physics itself, and finally in biology, that are pointing in a decidedly theistic direction. And many scientists, I think, are now shifting from that strictly materialistic worldview to a more worldview that's more open to theism. And in the book, I argue that that's entirely appropriate given the evidence that we now have about biological and cosmological origins in particular.
That's absolutely fascinating. Again, I mean, of course, what you talk about in your book too, as well, is you talk about the three major scientific discoveries in the past century that do point to God. But before we get to that, you talked about some polling data that shows that the increasing number of young people, including those from religious homes, doubt even the existence of God. What are we seeing that's happening in our young communities today, and why are they being led astray, if you will.
Well, thanks for asking about that. I was thinking of working that into the first answer because it's an extremely important cultural shift that's taking place in the United States and in Western Europe, more in the West widely. The polling data, the pollsters are now tracking a group of young people from roughly 18 to 30 that they call the nuns, and by that they don't mean Catholic ladies in habits. They mean the religiously unaffiliated or non-affiliated agnostics and atheists in this cohort between 18 and 30 years old. And they're now as prevalent in the culture as religious Catholics or religious evangelicals. And this is this rise in the nuns has ensued from about it's been a lot over the last 15 or 20 years. There's been this dramatic rise, and it roughly tracks with the popularity of a new publishing genre known as the New Atheism or New Atheists. And these are writers who argue that science properly understood undermines belief in God, undermines the plausibility of such belief. Now, of course, that argument is not new, but it's been popularized in an incredibly effective way with books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins or Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss, or a whole host of other authors who have gotten into the mix. Even Stephen Hawking, near the end of his life, wrote a book called The Grand Design, which was essentially arguing that there is no design. And that atheism provides a better overall account of the evidence we have from the natural sciences. So this science-based atheism has been an incredibly influential. It's had a very influential effect on the rise of these religiously unaffiliated young people, many of whom, when you probe, and that's the other thing about the polling data, when you probe with these folks, you find that science has had an outsized influence on their disaffection with religion. 2/3 of young atheists say that the findings of science make belief in God less probable.
That's interesting.
Wow, that is very interesting, actually.
Wow. Well, my question for you is, in order for life to even exist, there needs to be a specific set of parameters. I'm talking from layman's terms here. I'm nowhere as intelligent as intellectual as he is, but there needs to be specific forces, elements, parameters, configurations for even life to exist. So how do we explain that?
Well, this is one of the things that very few people realize, and it's certainly not adequately discussed in our high school and biology textbooks. But Charles Darwin never explained or attempted to explain the origin of the first life. Instead, his theory of biological evolution attempted to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. Probably a single one-celled organism was what he thought would have kicked everything off. But he never explained where the one-celled organism came from. And subsequent attempts to do that have proven to be very difficult. And by about the 1980s, the specialized discipline of origin of life research had reached a state of impasse. When I did my PhD dissertation in Cambridge on origin of life biology, and my dissertation supervisor had attended in 1989 the International Society for the Origin of Life meeting, the technical meeting of people working in this field. And she came back from the meeting and confessed to me that she said the people working in our field are becoming borderline cranks because everyone knows that everyone else's theory doesn't work, but no one is willing to admit it about his or her own. And she said that's the very definition of being a crank, which was kind of a depressing assessment. But the problem is that the complexity of life that's been discovered, especially since the 1950s, in a period of tremendous discovery known as the molecular biological revolution, the complexity of life has outstripped anything that simple chemistry can do on its own. And so the idea that chemicals interacting in an undirected way could produce even the DNA and the protein molecules, let alone the whole complex integrated system that we call a cell, with all its organelles and molecular machines and the essentially automated factories that are involved in cellular metabolism, This is just implausible in the extreme. And by the mid 1980s, most people working in origin of life research were willing to admit that there wasn't a theory that was adequate. And since then, there's been essentially no progress from the standpoint of materialistic evolutionary theory. And yet I would argue that the things we're finding in cells, in particular, the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule and the complex storage, transmission, and information processing system that lies at the heart of all cellular life, provides powerful evidence for designing intelligence, because we know from our uniform and repeated experience that information, functional information, especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, which it is in the DNA molecule, always arises from an intelligent source. Whether we're talking about a computer program or a paragraph in a book or a hieroglyphic inscription or information in a radio signal, information is the hallmark of mind. It always arises from a mind, not an undirected process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life provides a powerful indicator of prior designing intelligence acting in the origin of life.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was talking about these guys before the show. Is people can't go into a laboratory and actually create something that's becomes alive and has a soul, has a spirit, and is actually doing what we do. Yet they want to talk about somehow it happened on its own up in nowhere land just from something blowing up. If you explode something, that creates chaos. And God isn't the God of chaos. So in my natural mind, I'm not a scientist. Just the kind of way that I think, I'm like, well, God brought order, not chaos. He didn't blow something up.
Well, your intuitive skepticism is well supported by specific scientific research. We're nowhere near building anything like a living cell ourselves. So-called synthetic life forms that have been constructed in the laboratory amount to nothing more than transferring genetic information from one cell to another, or they're dealing with pre-existing living systems and slightly modifying them. But even if we were able to, before I get into the even if point, one other point, that is that there are prebiotic simulation experiments that attempt to construct certain of the components of living systems, the amino acids that make up proteins, or the sugars, or what are called nucleotide bases, important chemical subunits of DNA. So there are attempts to synthesize under allegedly prebiotic conditions some of the chemical building blocks of life. But just producing the building blocks alone does not make a building.
Right.
The building blocks have to be arranged in specific ways in accord with the blueprint to produce something that is an actual building. And in the same way, in the living world, just getting the sugars or the bases or the amino acids does not either a DNA molecule or a protein molecule make, let alone the complex functionally integrated interactions between these large, what are called biomacromolecules. So we're nowhere near designing life ourselves, and even our attempts to build the building blocks require what is called extensive investigator interference. Chemistry on its own doesn't move towards building proteins or DNA, and certainly not DNA molecules that contain information that could go on to build proteins themselves, and so what the scientists have to do is they have to manipulate the chemistry. And they have to start with purified reagents. They have to heat things up to certain temperatures, cool them down at just the right time, eliminate byproducts from the reactions that would create what are called interfering cross reactions. All of this involves an extensive input of information into their chemical system, and that's all coming from the minds of the intelligent chemists. So what are these people simulating when they're doing this? I would argue they're actually simulating the need for intelligent design to get the chemistry to move in a life-relevant direction. And even then, we haven't gotten very far in that process. So and the general public doesn't really understand that this is the depth of these problems associated with attempts to explain the origin of life. Instead, we get simplistic depictions of a simple experiment that was performed in 1953 by a man named Stanley Miller, where he zapped some gases and got a couple of amino acids.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
I mean, I've always wrestled with it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You know, every great philosopher, every mind thinker, every scientist, deist, atheist, has at least come down to at least one thought, that there had to be a first uncaused cause. before propping ourselves up to be like God, can't we just realize that argument's futile and there would have to be God?
Mm.
Well, it's a very well framed question, because every worldview or philosophy or metaphysical hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, an overarching philosophy, and we all have one, even if we don't recognize it, we have some sort of default ways of thinking about the world. But every worldview has to have something that functions as a prime reality, something that is the thing from which everything else comes. And the dominant worldview at the end of the 19th century, as I mentioned, and the worldview that has continued to dominate our knowledge culture, the universities, the science labs, the law schools, the courts, the media, et cetera, in the 20th century and 21st century is called scientific materialism. And materialism affirms that matter and energy within pre-existing space and time are the things from which everything else comes.
Right.
And materialists have always affirmed the eternal existence of the physical or material universe, because they did not envision the universe arising from some external creator. So they regard matter and energy as effectively the stuff from which everything else comes, and some with some sort of self-organizing properties or laws within the universe doing the work of designing things. The contrary worldview in the West has always been theism, the idea that it wasn't matter that was eternal and self-existent, but rather God, and that God is a spirit with a mind, with self-conscious awareness, and therefore personal, and that God brought the material world into existence and then shaped it by his intellect into all the forms of life we see today. Those are two competing worldviews that have been offering differing explanations of fundamental reality for quite a long time. And the materialistic one has dominated from the late 19th century. But the science of the 20th and 21st centuries points, I think, to a theistic worldview. Theism provides a better explanation of the key events that we know about as far as the origin of the universe, its finely tuned structure that allows for life to exist at all, and for the information that's needed to build living systems. These three facts are best explained by a theistic designing intelligence rather than an undirected materialistic process of some kind.
Wow.
Or pre-existing matter.
Yes, right. That's very, very well said. Now, there is, what was it? So obviously we're talking about intelligent design. Now, one of the first things that you say in the three different evidences, if you could just expound upon that first one a little bit, because they're all fascinating, but in layman's terms, how would you kind of describe that? The first being, for example, the cosmic beginning came, in the 1920s, actually you talk about the cosmologist had discovered that the physical universe likely had a beginning. How do we come up with something like that?
It's an amazing story in its own right, irrespective of what you make of it from a metaphysical point of view. But it is an ancient question going back all the way to the Greeks. Is the universe finite? Did it have a beginning? And if so, what caused it to come into existence? Or is the universe infinite in time, stretching all the way back as far as we can imagine and further, such that we can think of the universe as the thing from which everything else comes, the unmoved mover, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it was a question that really no one thought you could settle on the basis of observations of the natural world. There were mathematical arguments in the Middle Ages against what are called against the prospect of what are called actual infinites. So there were certain paradoxes that arose if you actually tried to conceive of the universe as having an infinite duration in time, stretching all the way back. But it was a question that no one thought, that really didn't seem to be something that could be settled by science. And then in the 20th century, the observational astronomers started to notice that the light coming from distant, first what they thought were nebular gas clouds, and then later what they realized were actually separate galaxies, that the light coming from these objects in the night sky was being stretched out. Oh, wow. And it had longer wavelengths than it should have if the light were coming from an object a stationary distance away from us. And you may remember that from science class, if you shine light through a prism, it separates into different colors. red to violet, and the red light corresponds to the light with longer wavelengths. And so the light coming from these distant galaxies was looking redder than it should look if the objects in the night sky were a constant distance from us. So the astronomers concluded that these galaxies were expanding outward. And as they surveyed different quadrants of the night sky, this was the consistent picture that they got of the universe. And Edwin Hubble, the famed Caltech astronomer who worked at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Southern California, not only discovered that the light was being redshifted, but he discovered that the further the object was away from us, the faster it was receding, the more the light was being stretched out. And this suggested a kind of spherical expansion of the universe, like a balloon being blown up. Now, if you're blowing up a balloon in the forward direction of time, things are getting further and further and further apart from each other. But if you reverse that time direction in your mind's eye and you back it up like a cartoon on Saturday morning where suddenly everybody's going backwards, the galaxies would have been getting closer and closer and closer together. And eventually they would have congealed at a single point,
right,
marking the beginning of the expansion of the universe and arguably the beginning of the universe itself.
That was my question.
So this was the first main indicator, but there were other indicators from observational astronomy, and there's a parallel and very fascinating story to tell about developments in theoretical physics, starting with Einstein's theory of general relativity, which also implied a dynamic expanding universe, something that Einstein was originally loath to accept, but later grudgingly had to do so.
Well, that was my question. Isn't it measurable? If we can see that it's expanding, can't we calculate that? I mean, I'm talking simplest terms.
Yeah, you can back calculate it
and reverse
knowing
it.
Things about the speed of light and the distances and with light years to distant galaxies, and estimates have been made of the origin of the universe at about 13.8 billion years is now the accepted number. But that's still, what's most striking about that is that that number is pointing to a definite beginning. And if you bring the Einsteinian physics into this, it gets even more interesting, because according to Einstein, space and time are connected, and matter actually is bending the fabric of space. So his theory of what's so-called general relativity, his theory of gravity, implied, if you stop and think about it, that there must be some outward pushing force in the universe, because if the only force at work is gravity, then any massive body would curve space so tightly that you get just a big black hole. And if the universe is expanding outward in the forward direction of time, eventually, if you go far enough back, we would have this increasingly dense concentration of matter, making space increasingly tightly curved. And eventually, and this is what Stephen Hawking proved in the 1960s, eventually you'd reach a limiting case where the curvature of the universe would go to an infinite, corresponding to zero spatial volume, marking the beginning of the universe. So Einstein's ideas had these profound implications for a beginning. He didn't like it at first and tried to gerrymander some of his equations so he could get the outward pushing force of gravity to exactly the inward pushing force of gravity to exactly match this outward pushing force called the cosmological constant. Right. That proved to be an unstable solution, and it was contrary to the observations. And eventually Einstein acknowledged that the attempt to get around the evidence for a beginning was the, quote, greatest blunder of my scientific career. So we've had these two strains of scientific developments, the discoveries of the observational astronomers and the implications of developments in theoretical physics surrounding Einstein's theory of gravity, general relativity, both of which have pointed to a beginning.
Now, explain something to me. Now, is the expansion linear? I mean, I guess it's a two-part question. Yeah. Is the expansion linear in time, or is it changed during
Well,
time?
Current thinking is that the universe is actually accelerating in its expansion, which is really mind-blowing. It's going faster and faster and faster.
My question would be then how do, I don't know, but how do we get to the 13.8 billion years or trillion years, million years, whatever it is?
Well, that's a calculation that can be made based on the expansion rate, other variables like knowing something about the speed of light and the distances to the galaxies within the observable universe. So it takes a little fiddling with the math to get there. But if you know that things are expanding outward, and you have a sense of how rapid that is, then you can back extrapolate to a point where there could be no more contracting in the reverse direction of time.
Call me the uneducated skeptic here. My question would be then, because I know if I remember, not so much that, but if I remember correctly, that number has changed a few times.
That's right. It's changed in response to different estimates of something called the Hubble Constant. And so it was initially one of the original problems with the Big Bang, and I discussed this, is that the estimates for the age of the universe were initially were rendering numbers that were lower than estimates for the age of the Earth. Clearly, the Earth existing within the universe couldn't be older than the universe in which it exists. So, but as better measurements were made as to the Hubble constant, then as the calculations were reworked, the number for the universe increased well beyond the age of the Earth. So,
I don't want to put you on the spot, but as far as the age of the Earth, what is your take on that? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, the typical age generated by radiometric estimates is about 4.5 or 4.6 billion years. I've generally accepted. I do accept the great age of the universe and the Earth. I know there's within the Christian world in particular, there's a big debate about the age question. Most of the arguments that we've made for intelligent design are effectively age neutral, because they're not attempting to settle the question of the age of the Earth. They're attempting to decide whether what we're looking at is something that was really designed or something that merely appears to be designed. It's the question of the illusion versus the reality of design.
So it's safe to say time wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't put a
right.
No, it doesn't make a difference. When you get into the cosmology, this is sort of, it's presupposed in the knowledge we have about the beginning comes with knowledge that we have about the speed of light, with knowledge about the expansion rate of the universe and that sort of thing. And so it is possible to make these calculations. I do oddly also think that anatomically modern humans have not been around that long. I'm very skeptical about some of the paleoanthropological accounts of human origins, and human art and agriculture and things like that are fairly recent, not in the millions of years, but in the tens of thousands. And so I think my overall view of things like that is ancient universe, ancient Earth, recent humans. But
that makes sense.
It's kind of a hybrid view. There are people within the Christian world whose touch point on these discussions is a particular interpretation of the book of Genesis.
Right.
I am a biblical Christian. Not all proponents of intelligent design are. Not all theists are. But I've never thought that the book of Genesis was giving us was making claims about the Earth's age that suggests that we're talking about something very young. And I have a biblical reason for thinking that, as well as scientific ones. When you get to the day 4, the day 4 account in the creation account, we're told that God created or caused to appear the sun, the moon, and that these were given as markers of the days, the years, and the seasons.
Right.
And yet the days of creation, the yoms of creation, have already been established. We've had 3 of them so far. And you get to the 4th day and you realize there's no way that the days of creation could have been measured the way we measure time today, because the time markers, the sun and the moon, I mean, we measure time in a pre-scientific way by the number of times the sun crosses the ecliptic and returns the next morning.
Right.
So prior to either the visibility of those objects in the night sky or their creation, whichever way you take that day 4 passage, there was no way to measure time. So there's a biblical scholar I respect named Jack Collins, a Hebrew philologist who studied in England roughly the time when I was there. He's now a professor at Covenant Seminary. And when he's asked, well, are the days of creation old Earth Hugh Ross days, or are they young Earth Ken Ham days? And he says, neither. They're days of indeterminate time from a human point of view. And so I do think you have to kind of look to the science to settle the question of the age of the Earth. I don't think the Bible is giving specific information in time measurements that are meaningful to humans. I think the days of creation are relevant to God's sequence in creation, not to our timekeeping methods.
In an attempt to put God in the box, per se, to kind of hold him to a set standard, a set time, and this is the way it is, and it's kind of very, singular optic view here to
yeah. I mean, the Bible itself says a day in the sight of the Lord is like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Be careful. Don't convert the time frame of the deity into human minutes and seconds, or you might get thrown off. So I do think that the sequence of events in Genesis is remarkable. It's remarkably accurate to what we now know about natural history, and it's remarkable that someone writing that at the time of Moses could have known all those things, including the most significant of all the affirmations of the Genesis creation account, which is that the universe had a beginning. There's a famous physicist named Arno Penzias who discovered something called the cosmic background radiation, which is one of the key evidences for the Big Bang theory, the Big Bang cosmology. And Penzias has said that the data we have are precisely what I would have predicted if I had nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. So there's a convergence that's emerging between modern science, certainly the broader worldview of theism, but it is remarkable that the first words of the Bible have been confirmed by modern cosmology.
So would it be an accurate statement that science is finally catching up to the Bible, or is the Bible catching up?
Well, you may know that famous passage in the book by Robert Jastrow, an agnostic Jewish astrophysicist who was the director of the Goddard Space Institute. He wrote a book in the 1980s called God and the Astronomers about these cosmological discoveries. And he says, for the scientist who's lived by the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the tallest peak and pulled himself up over the last mountain, only to be greeted by a band of theologians who've been waiting there for centuries, he said. So, he perceived the clear theistic implications of the new cosmology.
That's awesome.
And I think these implications can be unpacked independently of a reliance on revelation, on scripture. There's an ancient philosophical argument that runs like this: whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Since all causes are separate from themselves, the cause of the universe must be transcendent. It must be something that transcends matter, space, time, and energy, the domains that that begin with the beginning of the universe. That to awful lot of philosophers has sounded like God, especially when you realize the necessary power and will required to produce everything from effectively nothing physical.
Wow. So now, one of the things I've heard you mention before, and I'm going to probably mess this up, but it's something along the lines of, it's not that science is not proving Christianity, but Christianity is proving science. Do I have something? Is that along the lines of what you said? I've heard you say something about.
Well, maybe I'd back up on that. Just put it in a bit different context. Yes. Generally, in that I'm a little titchy about the word proof.
Okay.
Because proof is something that can be attained by mathematicians if they start with self-evident axioms and reason deductively to certain conclusions. Mm-hmm. Scientists don't really reason that way, and therefore scientific theories are not proven. They are, but they can have evidential support. Mm-hmm. And some scientific theories are better than others because they do a better job of explaining the evidence than their competitors. And so a standard of scientific support, a high standard of scientific support would be something like an inference to the best explanation. That's a mode of reasoning where you have multiple competing hypotheses trying to account for some body of data. And what I do in the book is first use that method to establish a case for intelligent design, and then I extend it and apply that same method again and say, well, if we've got evidence for intelligent design at the beginning of the universe and the fine tuning, which we really haven't talked about yet, or in the digital code and DNA, and what worldview best explains this? So I take it one notch further and say, what worldview or metaphysical hypothesis best explains the big three evidences that we have about the origin of the universe, the origin of its finely tuned structure that allows for the possibility of life, and the origin of the information that's necessary to build life in the first place. And there I argue that the best explanation is not just designing intelligence of some unspecified kind, but rather a designing intelligence that has the attributes that, for example, Jews and Christians and other traditional theists have long ascribed to God.
Now, you say digital programming, and I've heard you say that a few times in a couple of interviews that I've also seen that you've given. Can you get into that a little bit in terms
Yeah, absolutely. I got some people that are camping out on my Facebook page that are just screaming, DNA does not contain digital information. Just what's he talking about? Let's go back to the molecular biological revolution. 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule, the beautiful double helix structure that we all know.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In 1957, 58, Crick puts forward something called the sequence hypothesis. And here he proposes that the chemical subunits that run along the interior of that twisting helix, and these subunits are called bases or nucleotide bases, he proposes that those chemical subunits are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like the zeros and ones in a section of software.
Okay.
That the DNA molecule contains information or instructions for building the crucial proteins and protein machines, and it contains those instructions in an alphabetic, typographic, or digital form. This is actually not controversial. Richard Dawkins himself says the DNA contains something like a machine code. Bill Gates says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. Leroy Hood, a leading biotech bioengineer here in the Seattle area, has written an article where he simply describes DNA as containing, quote, digital code. So this isn't controversial. The DNA molecule contains information. The information is in an analog form. It is conveyed by a 4-character code where each of the chemical elements function as letters or digital characters.
So if that's there, what does that speak to?
That's a stop-press moment in history and biology, because by 1965, Crick's sequence hypothesis has been confirmed. The whole gene expression system has been elucidated. We now know how the information in DNA directs the construction of the protein molecules and machines made of proteins that are absolutely crucial to keeping cells alive. It's a technology that that maps functionally exactly onto what we use in manufacturing when we use something called CAD/CAM, computer assisted design and engineering, where you have digital information directing the construction of mechanical parts and systems. This is an unbelievable discovery at the foundation of life. In the 19th century, they talked about the cell as a simple homogeneous globule of protoplasm. That's Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's famous bulldog. By the end of the 20th century, we know we've got a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system that's only part of a larger automated kind of factory for building and maintaining all the elements of cells. It's really an unbelievable level of complexity, and that's why the origin of life research broke down. The simple chemistry does not produce structures like that, and you need to account for the origin of information. And again, there is one cause in the universe of which we know that produces information, and that is a mind. One of the great information scientists who first applied information theory to molecular biology, Henry Quasler, said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. So it is indeed a digital form of information. It's a functional form of information, and that type of information in our experience always arises from intelligence.
So this can't happen by accident.
That's right.
Or by undirected material processes, the so-called self-organizational laws, or the combination of natural selection and random changes or variations. There's the brute chance approach. Well, just, eventually what happened, because there's so many molecules knocking into each other, they'd eventually produce something like a living cell. I show in Signature in the Cell, I run calculations on that. It's completely implausible. There's not enough time in the universe and not enough events in the universe to search what's called the space of possibilities.
Can't we just add another 14 billion
to make
years?
That plausible. No, give them 13 billion, give them 4 billion on planet Earth. It's not enough. And this is widely accepted among leading origin of life researchers. Nobody attempts to explain the origin of life by reference to pure chance. They attempt to bring in self-organizational laws or some kind of prebiotic natural selection, but those proposals have deep problems as well, which I discuss in detail, both in my first book, Signature in the Cell, but also in this new one, return of the God hypothesis.
I'll definitely have to get this book. You've blown my mind.
It's absolutely unbelievable. So obviously, one of the things that was said, one of the men that you mentioned was Frederick Burnham, I think it was, in the notes. He said, the idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years, and you concur on this. Can you go into that a little bit? What was he saying here, and what are you concurring exactly?
He was writing in the mid-90s after George Smoot had discovered some anomalies in what's called the cosmic background radiation that were expected if the Big Bang theory were true, but which had not yet been found. And Smoot, when he found them using something called the COBE satellite, the Cosmic Background Explorer satellite, announced to the media, he said, seeing these predicted anomalies that confirm the Big Bang theory and therefore a beginning to the universe, he said, it's a little bit like looking at the face of God. Now, he was speaking a bit hyperbolically, but Burnham, I think, was just surveying the whole shift that was taking place in cosmology and physics and so forth, and saying, the idea that God created the universe is not so implausible after all, because after all, we're looking at the creation event.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with trying to explain the origin of the universe by reference to within the scientific materialistic framework, let's put it that way, is that prior to the beginning of the universe, there's no evidence that there was any matter or energy or space or time, because those are the things that begin to exist. If matter and energy come into existence a finite time ago, you can't refer to matter and energy before that as the cause of the origin of matter and energy, because before they began to exist, no such entities existed. So I used to tell my students, before the beginning of the material universe, there was no matter to do the causing, and therefore materialistic explanations are very, very strained indeed. Robert Dicke, a famous physicist from Princeton, who had been looking for the cosmic background radiation, but then was gazumped by Arno Penzias and Wilson, said that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. But if matter and energy and space and time themselves begin to exist a finite time ago, you need a different kind of explanation. And one of the things I do in the book, using this method of inference to the best explanation, is I present the different metaphysical hypotheses about the origin of the universe, showing that materialism really fails. It, after all, expected an eternal self-existent universe, thus Carl Sagan's famous mantra, the universe is all there is and all there ever was and all there ever will be. No, the universe was not the only thing that it ever was. It has not always been here. So materialism is really not a good explanation for the origin of the universe, but something like theism or deism could provide an adequate explanation, because they posit the existence of an entity that exists separately from the universe, one with intelligence and power. And so those two hypotheses, I think, are in the running. I have other reasons for excluding deism, namely that the God of deism doesn't act after the beginning of the universe, and yet we have evidence of design in the information at the foundation of life, the information that comes into our biosphere that makes life possible long after the beginning. A deistic God doesn't act after the beginning by definition. So I think what we're looking at when we look at the whole ensemble of evidence is evidence for a God that has the profile that classical theists have always said was the correct one.
Wow.
This is good stuff.
This is very good stuff. Number one, please, if to the listeners out there, Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen C. Meyer. They can get the book anywhere, correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
All the online distributors, Barnes and Noble, Indie Books, Books A Million, Amazon, and I have a website for the book. Our web designer at Discovery, Nathan Jacobson, has just done a fantastic job, and the website allows you to navigate to the website's returnofthegodhypothesis.com. It allows you to navigate to my author page. From there, you can go to the pages for other books, as well as the a YouTube channel that has debates and videos that I've done, as well as animations of these fascinating miniature machines that are at work in cells. So it's a good resource for people that want to take a deeper dive into all this.
And I hope that they do. Because,
I do.
Yeah. So I think that's the thing. Some people stop at, well, I don't know about that, and they give their opinion and they walk away. But if they could just take a deeper look into the things that, like you're saying, I think that they would come out the other side thinking, man, I had it wrong. Only because...
Well, I think they'll find that there's a lot here. We've in a way just scratched the surface looking at the main arguments for intelligent design and for a theistic designer. There are obviously counter arguments, things like the multiverse or something else called quantum cosmology. And I take great pains to address, present those alternative hypotheses fairly, but then also critique them and show that even if you accept these alternative views, you still don't get away from the God hypothesis. For example, the multiverse idea, which has been devised to explain the exquisite and improbable fine-tuning of the universe, turns out to require universe generating mechanisms that themselves require prior unexplained fine-tuning. So even the attempt to explain the fine-tuning takes you back to prior fine-tuning. And so I go into a lot of detail looking at the competing hypotheses and weighing the explanatory power of each. And I think it gives the reader a chance to really think this through for themselves, because I approach it fairly deliberately, but also try to tell a story to keep it interesting.
Right. For people like us who can't understand, we don't.
I think there's a famous classic song that theorizes this all together. I think Julie Andrews sang it. Nothing came from nothing. Nothing ever could.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's pretty good. She's not a bad cosmologist.
Well, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, thank you so much for being with us tonight on the Kingdom Mike Show. We really appreciate your time and all your efforts and the passion that you have for doing this, because this is the stuff that people really need to understand and know. I mean, if we need to look at this kind of thing.
Thank you. Thank you for your great questions and a good deliberative conversation. That's what we need here.
That's what we need always, yes. Well, thank you again. God bless you. And again, people go out there. And you can go also, I think it's StephenCMeyer.org too as well, I think.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep.
Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for educating us.
Yeah, bless you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So there you have it. You know what?
That was awesome.
Yeah,
my mind is blown.
I love science.
Yes.
I love playing with it a little bit, but I don't ever see myself getting that far.
No.
You see, those things like roll off their tongue.
Well, it's not hard it's not hard to be smarter than me. And I just love it when people are that much smarter.
Right.
It's like, wow.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we appreciate it, and everyone who's watching right now, thank you so much for dealing with our technical difficulties in the beginning. We had a little power surge. A little mouse hit a button or something like that, I think. So we don't know what happened exactly.
I'm gonna call it a big bang.
A big bang.
I'm not equipped to challenge him on the young Earth. And I can see. Yeah. I can understand. Not sure. I have to look into it more. Makes sense.
But did you see what he said, though? He said he talked about the Earth and being people, humans. I can go with 10,000 years. Yeah. But the universe at its large, we don't really know. I mean,
and he doesn't think the Bible conflicts with that as well.
But maybe. It doesn't change my mind about God.
No, it doesn't change my mind at all.
God is God and can do anything He wants to do.
And who am I to tell him he's wrong?
He always was. He always is, and he always will be. Yeah. I don't think all of a sudden he appeared and then was like, oh, you know what?
Same today, yesterday, and forevermore.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to make man today. I mean, he was probably here for a very long time. I don't know. I mean, the bottom line is that someday we will know, for sure.
Well, there are credible people out there that make the argument that between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, there's a gap. It's the gap theory.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I don't know.
Yep.
Does it negate who God is? Does it marginalize what Christ did on the cross? No. Either way, we still have to come to the deciding factor of who was Jesus Christ and what did he do for you.
Right. And it's like going back to the alien theory. Whether that happens or not, or if it's real or not, it doesn't change my view of what he did for us.
It does not discount the Scripture, and it does not discount what Christ did on the cross.
That's exactly right.
So if you want to still dive into this, that's fine. You can say it's 14 million years old. You can say or 14 billion years old, or you can say it's 10,000 years old. It doesn't make a difference. Still, what are you going to do with the man named Jesus Christ?
Right. Yep.
You have to do something with that. If everything that we do here does not point to the cross, then it's futile.
But I think one thing, yes, absolutely, and I think one thing that we can all agree on here, as him too, of course, is that the point is that when we look at science, what it does is point to the scientist, and that is God Himself, the mind, as he was talking about. There is a mind, there is an intelligent design that's orchestrated all of this.
Absolutely.
There's no other rhyme or reason why we could be here except for an intelligent designer. And, but again, every time we look at science, it should, if we're honest, it should make us fall more madly in love with how incredible him himself and how awesome he really is and what he can do and what he's done.
And if you finally have come to the point to realize, all right, finally, there is a God. It's not me.
Right. Yeah. Go start there.
You've gotten to the point where, okay, well, who am I to try and figure out? As the scripture says, his ways are higher than ours.
Yes.
So to try and put him in a box, I mean, we can only, in our little finite minds,
which is small,
can only think so much and can only hypothesize so much, can only theorize so much. If there's a creator that created all the universe,
yep.
Who are we to make it any more complicated than that?
Well, the stinky thing there is that we do try to make it more complicated than that. I think we mentioned, and again, you said, and I agree with you, we said Bill Nye. Well, you said he's not a scientist. I don't think so either.
He's an entertainer.
But exactly, and he thinks that he is. And I'm not even going to talk about the
He
debate.
can make great volcanoes out of vinegar and baking soda all he wants.
Stay there.
Yeah, stay in
there.
the kitchen.
Yeah, enjoy that, man. Like then, I mean, these guys again, they want to try to discover. And I remember at the end of that that debate with Ken Ham. It doesn't matter who won or who lost or whatever you think. It's just at the end of it, I remember him just lifting. What I think it is all about is just discovering. Like, and he held up a rock. Like when we discover something like this and realize that, I'm like, yeah, but dude.
You're worshiping creation, not the creator.
Yeah, that's cool that you discovered that, but you know what? I'd rather discover more about the person who actually put that in your hand.
Right.
You were able to pick that up. That rock was created by something, and you should be going like this, like, thank you for doing that, but you're not. You're going like, I discovered this. I did this. I. It's always an I in there.
Always,
yeah. Exactly.
Knowledge puffs up, doesn't it?
It really does. It really does. That's the problem right there. Knowledge, pride, and it comes before the fall. Hopefully we all learn our lessons quickly,
dude,
whatever they are.
I'm still learning.
Well, dude, that's why the body of believers, the body of Christ, is so imperative to be together and unified, because if we're all honest, like you mentioned, we're all falling short all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's why we need each other. It's why we need not to point the finger and say I'm better than you. It's just saying like, dude, trust me, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go on now. Let's do this together and keep focusing on the cross. But yeah,
why is there such a concerted effort though to disprove? I mean, he's even said it's pretty much widely accepted that the maybe creation is not so far out of the scheme of reality.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying that, but those who continue to argue, those who aren't educated, and I'm not beginning to say that I am, but why is it such a exerted effort to go out there and disprove God, that there isn't one?
It's a great question.
There is so much energy that goes into that than there is into just realizing, you know what, maybe I don't need to be God and try and answer these questions and just accept what people who are far more educated than we are.
This seems like a more generalized statement, but you know what? We all find a purpose in life. I think that in their mind, that's their purpose. They don't have a purpose. Before Christ, I didn't. I really was like, what is the point of this?
But who's the author of confusion?
Oh, of course. And they're being used.
They're being confused.
They're tools.
I mean, I don't want to live that kind of life.
No way. Nope. But if they can figure it all out, they can do it.
A life of uncertainty.
Yeah. Right.
A life of well, that can't be the right way. So I'm going to disprove you and find out that you're not right. I am, but not give you any evidence of it and continue to put yourself in this little wormhole.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a wormhole. It really is.
A rabbit hole.
Vacuum. Yeah. So
it sucks.
It's that's the problem. I think you mentioned that to me. It's a joke. I kind of giggled at it. That's the problem with vacuums.
Yep, they suck.
Okay. So that's a dad joke. Hey, listen, thank you guys so much for tuning in and being with us tonight as we had an incredible guest on who was, our guests are so patient. Sometimes we have little things and they're so excited to talk about what they talk about.
Oh, when you're such a big platform like the Ken and Mike show,
right?
I mean, you're going to be patient.
Exactly. Exactly. But you know what?
What did we say about pride?
Yeah, right. I do want to make a couple of things, a mention of some things. Make sure you go to the bmgnetwork.com because you're going to find something, a recent post, column by the Pac man himself, the Pac perspective there, and also his newest and latest podcast. And there'll be some more new podcasts coming up by myself, Mike, and Kristen soon, hopefully when she heals up, and a brand new podcast coming out soon, and I'll mention the name of it. It's called The Adrienne Ross Show, and you can check out, you can look her up on Facebook if you want to. Her page is up and running. It's not visible yet, but it will be, but she's going to be having her podcast out soon, her show entitled The Adrienne Ross Show, and that's going to be coming at you in the middle of May.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic, yeah. It's going to be great having some panel discussions with Miss Adrienne on.
Yeah,
it's
I look forward to it.
Yep. So, Mike.
Thanks for coming in, Ken.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Yeah, thank you. Mel, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Ken and Mike Show. We are excited to watch next week. Do we know what's going on next week? We still don't know. We're just winging it.
Yep. No, we'll have something great for you, but we'll leave you in suspense.
Suspense? Yeah, sure.
So it's going to be good.
Next week, Tuesday, 6 p.m.
Eastern Standard Time.
Eastern Standard Time.
Yes.
You're on Facebook, YouTube, and every other place that you want to
find us. And if you haven't subscribed to YouTube,
we can be found.
Please do. Please do. And this video will be edited and fixed. God bless you guys. Thank you so much. Yes. We will tune in with you
next week.
Yes.
Can't
right
wait.
Here. Ken and Mike Show.
Yes.
Yeah. With Mel.
Mel just said nothing tonight.
Yeah, leave the mouse out of here next time, too. Push that button. All right. All right?
No, Mel's not going to say a word.
The Ken and Mike Show.